Committee firing.
Yes.
Now, be that as it may, Ms. Mercury, you would have no idea what the status of those 124 undervotes were unless you got a chance to look at the VV-pad, isn't that true?
That's correct. I wouldn't really know whether those really were undervotes or whether they were intended as write-ins. Or also, I don't have any way of knowing whether they were undervotes that were caused by the computer as opposed to undervotes that the voter intentionally undervoted. So there's no none of the above choice. So since we don't have a none of the above choice, we assume the absence of a vote is actually that there is no vote. But when you look at the procedures, the ones that were issued by the Secretary of State, what they say about in those procedures is that if the voter chooses to create a blank ballot, that is a choice of the voter generating a blank ballot. But we also know that in a number of instances, computers themselves have actually generated blank ballots when a blank ballot was not intended by the voter themselves. So there's nothing in the procedures that deal with what happens if the computer has disenfranchised the voter by deleting their vote and not recording it on the MBB or in the electronic totals. And so again, we don't have any way of knowing whether the 124 actually were deleted by the computer, whether they were actually write-ins, whether they were deliberately cast as blank ballots by the voter, unless we actually look at the VV-pads, because the VV-pads say what the voter actually verified as having been the case.
Okay. And moving away from these 124 undervotes that have, well, actually, let's stay there for one more moment. You've reviewed documentation surrounding this case, right?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And are you aware of the fact that an employee from the Registrar of Voters has testified in the declaration that this 124, or 142, excuse me, 124 undervotes is within the range of error?
I have read that.
Objection, Your Honor. That misstates the declaration, Ms. Sussman.
I'm going to read that declaration, and of course, that will be the best proof of what she says. Go ahead.
Okay. And are you aware of that fact?
Yes, yes, but not necessarily in that wording, but
Okay. Now, based on your experience in this area of expertise, what's your opinion of that statement?
well, with regard to the range of error, there is a fairly substantial range of error on voting machines. And that's something it's sort of like dirty laundry that doesn't get aired very often. Unfortunately, what we know about voting machines is that there is an allowable failure rate. And that failure rate actually exceeds the failure rate for many other types of electronic equipment. And this particular failure rate, what I'm referring to is what we call in the industry as a mean time between failures rate. It's a rate that's generated in terms of numbers of hours. And what the rate actually consists of is a number of hours within which it is acceptable for a voting machine to fail and that still be within the acceptable amount of failures for this type of equipment. Unfortunately, that rating was set at a fairly low threshold. The rate itself specifies that if voting machines fail at the rate of approximately 9.2% in a 15-hour election day, and we talk about a 15-hour election day, we're talking about setup time, the actual election day itself, and then the tallying time at the end of the day. It is acceptable for voting equipment to fail in the rate of 9.2% during a 15-hour election day period, and that's acceptable by the federal standards.
Okay, but when you say fail or failure rate, you know, that's a technical term. What does that actually mean?
Yes, the failure rate could be a whole host of things that are all glomped together under that failure rate. So for example, if the batteries were not charged properly and then they discharged during the election and the voting machine just immediately shut off, you know, maybe 8 hours into the election, that could constitute one of those types of failures. We've had failures where it's referred to as vote flipping. You press for a candidate and for some reason there may be static charge on the screen or what have you, and then it flips over to another candidate. We've seen that even with the heart. You don't press the touch screen, but you know, a failure of the dial to not work properly. a failure for the transmission between one machine and the host machine, you know, the boss machine, the central machine, to fail. And any of these types of failures, they may be catastrophic failures, which could include the loss or alteration of vote data, or they could just be temporary failures where the machines just don't start up properly at the beginning of the day. And we've seen that in Orange County, particularly in 2004 when the machines were brand new. We saw a host of different types of failures of that sort.